Thank you, everybody. My name is Catherine Bolten. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, and I've been working in Sierra Leone since 2003. I was there most recently, actually in May and June of this year, just as the virus was starting to worry people locally. They were still able to joke about it and imagine that it wouldn't get as big as it did. But as soon as that started happening, I did what I usually do, which is sort of started getting in contact with people that I'm working with, and this prompted me to get my first smartphone ever. As everyone said, you need to get WhatsApp, that's how we'll keep in touch with you. So my phone's been going off basically 24 hours a day for the last couple of months as I've been getting constant updates from people about the situation in Sierra Leone. And so this presentation is actually based on a report of 2 villages that my friends and contacts pieced together over the last couple of weeks, really asking the question why it is that 2 villages located right next to each other, about 150 yards away from each other is where they draw the boundary, have completely different experiences of Ebola virus, understandings of Ebola virus, and one village has lost 20% of its population and the other has had no cases whatsoever. And so this presentation I decided to call Cosmology of Care, because what we're dealing with is how people understand what it means to be human and their place in the world and their relationships with each other, and how all of these things interact with the world of the unseen, which we would call the ritual world, the religious world, the spiritual world, and how that world isn't just one of a good place for the ancestors, things that you aspire to, what happens to you in the afterlife, but it's also a place that's fraught with magical dangers that people are constantly having to sort of mitigate and work on through the course of their lives and the course of their relationships with each other. So, compiling together everything that people were telling me about what happened in these 2 villages, I decided to throw up a bunch of categories that will help you sort of stay on track with the story that I'm about to tell you. And the differences are actually many and various, and factors, that it's not just 1 or 2 things that are determining the difference. It's 5 or 6 things in each village that were completely different that will tell you whether transmission is going to happen in one and not another. So in the, I call it low transmission village because we still don't know if there are any cases there yet. It's still so far the no transmission village. What we have is a highly proactive chief who is trusted by his people. He will make decisions that radically affect their ability to interact with each other, and yet, because they're so afraid of this virus, but they trust him, they will do whatever he asks them to. And there is also a nurse that was born in the village, raised in the village, went and got her degree, and then came back to the village, and she's also sort of very trusted local soul. And the 2 of them together enforced the isolation of this village from the village right next door, which has about as opposite a situation as you could possibly have. You have fears of witchcraft, swear bombs, which I'll go into, Tumbu, which is another thing I will go into, that was a product of education efforts, Ebola education efforts in the village. And the biggest problem is actually political friction. The chief is kind of an ambivalent figure. People don't necessarily trust him because his mother is not from the local tribe, which is the Timni tribe. And in ordinary times this isn't a problem, but as soon as there's a time of fear and mistrust, these kinds of things come to the fore. And also that village is a local center of secret societies. These are the initiation societies by which young people become fully gendered and thus fully human. Children are seen as having no real gender. They're not male and female. They're just little children, and they're children until they go through secret society initiation. And so this institution is one of the most critical in local life, because this is how people actually become fully human. And unfortunately, in this village with high transmission, it's a center of secret society involvement. Now, I want to preface this with the fact that it was not the society itself that encouraged transmission, but what happens when one member, a very important member of that society, gets ill. And also, this village, there was no enforced isolation, and so people would move around once this fear and mistrust started to take hold. And this created really a perfect storm for infection. So, Yoni is the village with no transmission, and Yalisanda is the village that so far has had 43 deaths out of 250 people who live in this village. And patient 0 in this particular case was not from either one of these villages. She was from a village about 4 miles away, and one of her distant relatives died in not one of these villages either. It was a village called Bambali. But Bambali is close to Yalisanda, and so when she went to what they call greet the burial in Bambali, pay her respects to the dead, and this involves a lot of touching of the corpse in order to connote respect and love for that person. She went to greet the burial, and then she went to stay with her family for a couple of days in Yalisanda. And this is when she started getting ill. And as she got ill, and the chief of Yalisanda found out, his reaction was to expel her from the village. Rather than keeping her there and isolating the house, he was working on fears that had emerged in this chiefdom recently when people found out what happens to you when your family is quarantined, which is essentially that you are shut up for 21 days. More often than not, a soldier or 2 soldiers or 6 soldiers will spend their days with guns pointed at your house, and no one will bring you anything, no food, no water, nothing to cook with. And so the fear of quarantine is what was driving behavior here, and not the fear of infection. And the chief of Yalisanda was so afraid of the international community or the district medical team finding out that there was an infected person in his village and quarantining the village, that rather than even hiding her there in the village and trying to care for her there or exposing her, he tried to kick her out because of the potential political consequences for him and the consequences for the village if she was found to be ill. But of course, word gets around, and it got first to the village right next door, and the chief of Yoni was afraid of this because he thought obviously his village was going to be exposed. And so he went to talk to the chief of Yalisanda, and of course it was just straight denials. No, there's nobody sick here. You can come and look at the homes, there's nobody sick. And that's what the chief of Yoni did. He was poking his head in and saw that they weren't actually hiding anyone. Well, what was happening at this point is that the woman's son was carrying her on his back out of the village and trying to take her to her home village, and she died on the way, and he buried her in a shallow grave along the path. And the chief of Yoni, sort of seeing the fear in people, decided that he was going to try and break contact between the villages anyway, because he didn't trust what the chief of Yalisanda told him. And this was a political move that had consequences beyond which we could possibly imagine. And it's not just because they're neighboring villages. Yoni was a village that started as a land grant out of the goodness of the hearts of the people of Yalisanda. Yoni is a Limba village. It's a different ethnic group. And the Limba have trouble keeping land and holding on to land, even though they are considered the sort of autochthonous or the real indigenous people in the region, because the Timnis are politically stronger and they lay claim to all of the land. Well, the cosmology of this history of the 2 villages is that Yalisanda, out of the goodness of their hearts, said, you can come stay here next to us on our land and we will give you this village. And so the fact that the chief of Yoni would dare to say to Yalisanda, we are not going to be in relationships with you while this is going on, was about as bad an insult as he could possibly muster to give the Yalisanda chief, because these 2 villages were so intricately linked. They have family members in common, their children play together, they go to school together, even though they're considered different ethnicities. They started blending over time. And so this enforced isolation was essentially taking what had become one community and definitively dividing it in 2. And the chief of Yoni was willing to sort of risk the anger of the people of Yalisanda in order to keep his people safe, because he had the support of this nurse who was saying, in the short term, people will cry you down, they will hate you, they may try to curse you, but in the long run, this is what will ensure the survival of your people. So in order to put these things in context, you have to understand the momentousness of this decision by what it means to be human in Sierra Leone. Now, humans don't exist as sort of autonomous individuals, with rights vested in the individual. A human only exists as they are sort of intertwined in systems of care with each other. And you are not fully human unless you are involved in dozens of relationships where you nurture other people, you help other people, you give of yourself, and at the same time, they give of themselves back to you. And of course, you know what happens with Ebola is complete isolation of the individual who is sick. And the problem with this is that Ebola, by enforcing isolation, is actually undermining the very basis of sociality and therefore the very basis of what it means to be human. And so if you quarantine a village or isolate a village or cause people to react by isolating them, basically what you're doing is condemning them to complete social death. And social death is so much worse than physical death. If you die, people will take care of your body. They will look after you. You become an ancestor. You become part of the pantheon of the history of people of this place. If you are isolated, you essentially are stripped of your essential humanity. And it's considered so much worse to fail to be a person rather than to be a dead person. And this has basically colored the entire story of Ebola in Sierra Leone, in that an Ebola death is not nearly as bad as an Ebola burial, which is something I'll go into, where people cannot greet you, your body, they cannot respect you, they cannot wish you well in the afterlife. And as these pictures, I chose these two pictures because these came up early in the epidemic. And people in Sierra Leone see these pictures. It's not like these pictures are just for the consumption of people in the West, because they have WhatsApp, they have phones, and they're on the internet all the time. There is nothing more frightening than these two images, this woman and her baby basically isolated in a home. And what you have at the bottom is a man who was sick and took shelter in a school and died there alone. And the first reaction when somebody came to get him was this person in a PPE moon suit who didn't touch him, didn't handle the body nicely, instead sprayed the body, waited half an hour, called the burial team, and brought him out. And this is essentially, everything that could possibly be inhuman about this was what was happening. And there is so much more fear of the inhuman than there is of actually just dying from a disease. So, what we have when you get this fear and mistrust, and this is something that Bonnie was very good at, is that you get upwellings of people coming up with their explanations of what happened. They're trying to grapple with what's going on, and they do so, in their language and with the models that they have on hand. And so the story continues in Yalisanda when the woman who died, her family members start getting sick. Her 2-year-old and 4-year-old grandchildren got ill and they died. And Yalisanda's chief denied that it was Ebola. He said, they're little and small children get ill. Sierra Leone typically has a very high under 5 mortality rate. And so everyone was like, okay, that happens, small children get ill. There's been a lot of upheaval lately, maybe they weren't being fed properly. And so having denied this, the children were buried in the normal way. All of the women of the village came together. They washed the bodies, the children were handled lovingly, and they held a funeral. And the chief of Yoni forbid any of his people from going to this funeral, which again is about the worst thing that could possibly happen. But because they trusted him, they agreed not to go. But this started causing further conflict between Yalisanda and Yoni. People shouting insults across the road to each other. Yalisanda youth taunting Yoni youth by throwing rocks at them, urging them to stop being sissies and to come on over and to face their fears. And, as the nurse in Yoni began to try and wonder what she was going to do about this, she went and confronted the chief of Yalisanda, and he said, it's not a disease, it's a family swear bomb. And this is the idea that the woman's family had been involved in a bad business deal, and that they had been the ones at fault in this business deal. And the wronged party were so upset that they cursed the family. And you can do this out of anger. And this is like a magical upwelling of anger, which you cause every member of the family over time to die a horrible death. And he said, so it wasn't Ebola, it was a swear bomb. Her family were, tricky business people, and this is what's happening. And this is considered a form of magic that people can bring to bear on the social world without them necessarily having magical powers. It just happens when you're furiously angry with somebody. And this is what happens when somebody breaks their obligations to you. So again, it's linked up with the social world. If someone who's supposed to nurture and supposed to care fails to do so, then a swear bomb is what results. So you can see how these cosmologies are intimately linked up with each other. That it's that failure of care that causes illness, not the other way around. And he was saying this is a family swear bomb, and at the same time, the district health team, the Ebola education team, were coming around doing their rounds in the area saying, we're going to try and explain Ebola to you in your terms. And the term they used was that Ebola was a tumbu, which is the word in Timni for any small living creature that wiggles. So a tumbu is these really big horny red caterpillars that come out in the rainy season that feed on fresh leaves. And it's also the word for maggot. It's the same word. And they use this word, they chose this word in Katimni because it's the smallest living thing that Timnis can identify. And so in trying to translate this idea of a virus to the local language, they picked something that is still visible to the eye. And this was a huge problem because everyone's like, where are the tumbu? We don't see them. To the point where another person who died in a village, one man was like, I'm going to prove that, they're telling lies and this is not tumbu. And he was actually going through the blood of the victim to try and find tumbu because you can see tumbu. And of course, he got ill, his whole family got ill, and all of them, save 2 people, died. And so, this raises a really critical question for Ebola education efforts, which is how is it that, the scientific and medical community get these messages across that are not just sensitive to local concerns, but also can be understood and reacted to appropriately in local areas. And so, my research assistant, Taylor, he was so frustrated. He's like, why did they try and turn science into Timni? Why didn't they just meet people where they are and tell them that it was a swear bomb, but that it's a swear bomb that's carried in people's blood, and therefore you shouldn't touch them because it's just so powerful that it infects their body. And he was going through all of these models that could potentially be used to get people to react appropriately, but using the language of magic in order to do so, rather than trying to create scientific literacy. And I know this is a huge problem for proponents of scientific literacy, but he said, this is too important to be a teaching moment. These were his exact words, which I find so horribly troubling, but at the same time, he said, if you tell them it's magic, it'll save their lives. And so this is something that really needs to go on the table, I think, when we talk about Ebola education. So how mistrust and fear rupture the social world. As I said, all of these things are sort of cascade effect. And when you get people fearing and mistrusting others, then those create the explanations for what's going on rather than the deaths actually creating the fear and mistrust. So after this had been snowballing for a while, people in Yalisanda started dropping like flies. And it was the nurse in Yoni who was instrumental in this happening, because she was called to patient zero's house just as the last family members were dying, and she immediately notified the Ebola quarantine and burial teams. And of course the village got wind of this, and the youth mobilized with machetes and stones, and they stood on their road and they prevented the quarantine team from coming in to identify the households. And the team said, okay, well, we'll be back tomorrow and we'll be back with force. And they meant military force. And they said, okay. That gave them the time for all of the people in the quarantine households to disperse into other households that were not marked for quarantine. And of course, when you see in this photo what happens when a person is identified as an Ebola case and they are completely isolated from the rest of their family, as was mentioned earlier, this isolation is so feared because it's social death. And they're never going to be seen again. So they cannot be buried properly, they can't be mourned properly, and they're probably not going to go to the afterlife. And the problem that arose in Sierra Leone when they said they were going to start quarantining homes was that with this cosmology of care, where you're talking about densely interlinked family networks where people can get nurturing from multiple people, the idea of home is not the physical house where you spend most of your nights. Home is where you go when you are seeking care. Home is the people you seek out who will look after you. And so what often happens in quarantined homes or homes where a death has occurred in Sierra Leone is the family members who are still there will get up and move to a place where they're more likely to find care. And so when the 3-day lockdown of Sierra Leone occurred over the summer, the people were saying this shouldn't happen. We're making this argument based on the fact that everyone's like, oh, a lockdown? Well, I'm going to go to my grandmother's house for the duration of that time. And as it approached, people moved more than they would have otherwise, rather than retreating to their home, because home is what happens when you're sick. And I knew this the first time I got malaria. Of course, the first thing I did was call my mom. I was like, well, I'm sick. She's like, well, I can't take care of you. And I was like, well, I'm calling home anyway, even though I had a ton of people around me. So it's not a foreign concept to us if we imagine it this way. If you're sick, if you're unhappy, you don't necessarily stay in your physical domicile. You go and seek out the people that represent home. So, as a result of the dispersal, you said almost 25% of Yalisanda contracted Ebola. And that's a village of 250 people, of which we know that 43 of them have died. So, what was even more dangerous than this was secret societies. And in Yalisanda, unfortunately, one of the people who was sick was the initiator for the Bangbani Society, which is the male initiation society. And this position is so important. He's essentially the person who is responsible for turning children into men, that they had to ensure that they could, if he died, bury him in the proper way. Otherwise, society would die locally, and that village would actually have to disperse because it would have no way of turning boys into men. And it was only if he got a proper burial, a social burial, that they would be able to transfer his power to somebody else. So, of course, they hid him, and they hid him very successfully. And when he died, it was about 3 in the morning, that 40 people convened in the bush outside of Yalisanda in order to bury him. And of course, this creates huge problems for the contact tracers because the society is so secret that nobody is allowed to know officially who the members of the society are. And if you probe, you will either be rebuffed or someone will enact witchcraft upon you that will cause you to die. And the contact tracers were so afraid of this that they couldn't even trace who it was who had been at that burial. They didn't know if they were from Yalisanda, they didn't know if they were from surrounding areas. And so there's potentially another 40 people who were infected who've gone somewhere else because of the necessity for the social and spiritual survival of this village to keep that burial secret. So after this happened, the paramount chief of the whole district deposed the chief of Yalisanda, saying that he was uneducated and he was part of the problem and not part of the solution. And his solution was a military one, placing checkpoints at every entrance to the town, soldiers stationed 24 hours a day outside of the quarantined homes. And the military response is being used automatically because the chief of Yoni and the paramount chief has said the chief of Yalisanda cannot be reasoned with. And he said, I, on the other hand, have a degree. And this is another part of the problem, as my research assistant was so, a part of the aspect of that he was so intent on is that you have to meet people with you where they are. And you can't treat people as though they are educated or uneducated and try to hit everybody with the same information and say, well, they're uneducated and therefore they can't understand. If the chief of Yalisanda was met where he was with information that actually addressed ideas of swear bombs and witchcraft, then perhaps it would have been possible to stop transmission in that town. So, what we have here is a photo of a Portuguese gun used by slave traders in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the reason I bring this up is because witchcraft writ large, this idea of the magical unseen world, started during the time of slavery, when you had white people, and most PPE is white, coming in with these technologies that could kill people invisibly. You would hear a bang, you would see smoke, and then somebody had something inside their body that would kill them agonizingly over the course of 2, 3, 5, 10 days. And thus arose this idea of the witch gun, that these are people who control the invisible world. They are magically dangerous, and they're not actually human. Their goal is to consume the resources of this world and make themselves fat and rich in the process. And so, of course, you have this idea now that witchcraft is in play, that is causing people to die invisibly. Well, bad news for the Yoni nurse, because she was contact tracing, she was able to predict which households would get sick. And by doing so, everyone's like, oh, you must be the witch. You must be the one who's actually shooting people because you're telling us who's going to fall sick, and you're absolutely right. And you're in cahoots with the chief in Yalisanda, or chief in Yoni, because he's preventing his people coming over here so they can't accidentally be in the line of fire when you fire this gun. And that had happened the day after the Yoni chief had imprisoned 3 teenage girls who were trying to get to their boyfriends in Yalisanda, just further strengthening this idea that the two of them were witches in cahoots with each other. And that the two of them were conspiring to make Yoni great while Yalisanda died, even though Yoni was supposed to be the inferior of the two villages, and that they were doing so by killing people and consuming all of the resources that the international community was bringing for Ebola relief. So you can see how anything that happens in this situation can be brought into and explained within local cosmologies. And the thing is that the Yoni nurse is so afraid of witchcraft reprisals that she believes that someone might shoot her with a witch gun in order to kill her, that she goes out at night and washes herself in sacred herbs to try and protect herself from reprisal witchcraft, even though she is educated and she doesn't believe in this stuff. Well, she's still afraid of it. So when you have this kind of reaction to Ebola, basically what it is that these abnormal antisocial reactions that the epidemic demands completely undermines the basis for sociality in the world, and thus the basis for being human. And you cannot be human if you cannot also become an ancestor, which is why an Ebola burial, being isolated, being put in a bag, being buried where no one can find you, is so much worse than just dying from the disease. And this is something that we have to be very, very clear on as we try to understand this going forward. And so, of course, this is my last slide, is the measures that the international community is taking to try and halt the spread of the disease are actually potentially making it worse because, of course, the newest technology is the infrared thermometer, which looks a hell of a lot like a witch gun. And on that note, I will end.